Good morning, Jacob Rupp here, men's coach. Is short. I got a great question from a former always student of mine. A little bit embarrassed. I kind of figured I knew I was going to say. He asked me this question again. What does it mean? You're flirting while married. So who are we talking about? Can you flirt with someone who is married? If you're married, can you flirt with somebody else? Should you flirt with your own spouse? Like, where are we going? I think we're going to answer all three. Step number one. I had a question from a student of mine who asked, am I allowed, he met a woman in the bar, he finds out that she didn't find out, she showed him that she had a ring on, and, so he wanted to know, like, carrying on a relationship with this woman, again, I thank you, I'm not revealing who this is, but, the woman's husband wasn't treating her well, whatever it might be, you want to know, is this problematic for me to be, not in a relationship, but carrying on an experience with this woman, and what's wrong with that? And he's like, yeah, I know that's bad, right? And so what I said to him was that the reality of flirting and the reality of why flirting is exciting is because there's no stability over there, right? So there's a certain, the most free you can be when you're flirting is when you have absolutely nothing to lose. The reason why people like to drink before you go to a bar, for example, is because you might lose your self-respect, your dignity, if you say something that's inappropriate, right? But the fun of flirting, really becoming a great flirter, whatever you want, right, is losing how to drop your inhibitions so that you can say stuff that is edgy, that you can kind of go out of your comfort zone, you can sort of, manipulate and figure out how do you elicit the reaction you want, which is the whole concept behind flirting, which is that you are convincing, so to speak, someone that's not interested in you necessarily to become interested in you. So I explained to him that because with a person that's married, right, that, and again, I knew he wasn't the kind of guy that was going to actually get in a relationship with this person because he knows that would be insane. But I said that it's going to drop the bar for you because there's so few inhibitions because the whole thing's like, bad. You'll never get that extra step of learning how to flirt when it actually could go. So the whole idea of why, illicit relationship, when you don't want to judge, whatever, I'm Jewish, so I'll say it's an illicit relationship. The reason why the relationship, the Talmud says, is so enjoyable is because it's specifically forbidden. So there's all kinds of stuff that you can do, that you can say, how you can act, because at the end of the day, you're already sort of in the wrong, and there's nothing that's like really going to hold you back from just kind of going all in. So now let's switch around to the other side. Let's say you are married. Can you flirt with somebody else? Again, what does that mean, flirting? What's the definition of cheating? Again, it's one of those things that people love to kind of play around with. I was chatting and smiling at, not me, right? This is one of those things. I will give a personal example, but I'm not going to give a personal example about this part. But let's say you're sitting in a restaurant and you're talking, you're flirting with some woman sitting next to you, right? So is that problematic? Is that technically cheating? So the very interesting way that I would analyze this and the way that I would think about this, because we are always far more positively judgmental of ourselves. No, it's not really flirting, right? Guess what? I didn't do anything, whatever it is, right? Is you think to yourself, the feelings that you have inside are those the kind of feelings that would make you feel uncomfortable if your spouse was showing that to somebody else. So let's say you're talking to a woman, right, and you're like, wow, I'm really enjoying talking to her because I like how what I say makes her smile, or I like that look in her eyes, or she's just got beautiful eyes, I like looking at them, right? So you think to yourself, what did I do? I didn't do anything, there's nothing bad with that. But you think to yourself, how would I feel, right, if my spouse, on the other hand, was like talking to this guy, and she was really enjoying it, and she was like, wow, I really like how he makes me laugh, and I like how he makes me feel, right? So the challenge over there is to realize to yourself, it's like, okay, so that's not necessarily good. So maybe you would define cheating for yourself as, the actual act, or a hug, or a kiss, or getting a number, or something like that. And you're like, no, I'm married, I would never do something like that. But the flip side is, how would I feel if my spouse was deriving the kind of pleasure that I'm getting in that kind of experience? That's what I'd say where flirting while married is problematic. Now, let's flip it around the other side. Do you even have to flirt? Again, this is for men. I'm sorry if you're a woman watching. I'm just going to say it from the masculine perspective. I don't understand the feminine perspective, right? But as a man, right, you're a married man, say you've been married 4, 5, 10 years, 2 years, whatever you want. Do you still have to marry? Do you still have to flirt with your spouse? Should you flirt with your spouse? Of course, women are thinking, of course, like, why wouldn't you have to flirt? But let's be very frank, right? The challenge is like this. We get in marriage. We want to be in marriage because we crave stability. in a lot of, in a big way, right? We want someone to come home to. We want someone to make, we want someone to have something to talk to. Again, like imagine trying to raise kids. I can't raise kids for 5 seconds when my wife's out of the house, right? Imagine trying to raise kids yourself as a single dad. Like, oh my God, terrible, right? So we love that stability. We want that stability. We crave that stability. And to a large extent, we look to that stability to sort of like shelter us from the world. We come home and, we're fat, or we are, sucking at our job, or we lose a client, and you come home and you go to your wife, you're like, oh God, I suck. And she'll be like, no, you're wonderful, you're great, you're such a good father. Whatever. Not that this happens to me ever, but that kind of a concept. So we crave that stability. The flip side is the very thing that we crave, that stability, that makes the spouse completely unattractive in our eyes, because we know what she's going to do, we know how she's going to act, we know how she's going to respond. We're going to know, like you get to know the person, and suddenly the thing that fired you up so much about her, which again, it's a phenomenal idea. Like I remember, that first time, and I think kind of every guy, again, I don't know, I didn't date Orthodox, I don't know how that works, but the first time you sort of get that insight that the girl you're like flirting with is like interested in you, or like she could like actually want to like talk to you, like you're so excited, you're like, oh my gosh, this is great. You're trying to think, how do I manipulate her to make her want to be around me more? Do I have to take her here? Should I go there? Should I be like this? So all of that stuff is so exciting. I literally remember it's whatever, we're all friends here, right? I literally remember like having like Julie's like face in my head, like emblazoned. I was in college, right? And all I could do is think about her, and I think about her when I wake up, and the whole conversation. You're going through this whole thing, and you're like, oh my God, I'm so into you. Like, how do I make you into me, and how do I become this guy that you really want? Anyway, so that's all exciting because you don't have her. But as soon as you have her, and also the thing that drives you crazy, like, if I could just get her to be like, I love you, I want to be with you forever, all this kind of stuff. I was listening to an amazing podcast with Chris Kyle. Chris Kyle was the American Sniper that the movie was made of. His widow was talking about, like, how longingly she was in love with her husband and how she'd do anything for him, and now I'm thinking about it as I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing, right? And sometimes, again, how dark is this, right? I'd want to hear what would happen if I would die, if my wife would go on and say something like that, because as a man, you just feel so, like, tremendously gratified, right? But the flip side is when you're actually in the relationship, and that's not being manifest and expressed all the time, so then, so we're looking for the dependency, but on the flip side, once you have that dependency, once she's like, I really need you, because, you have the arrangements of the finances and the kids and the house, everything like that, so then she becomes very unattractive in a lot of ways. And here's where I'm going to say, don't share this with your local Orthodox rabbi. Get an Orthodox rabbi, just don't share this video with him. He doesn't have Facebook anyway. That's why I'm here, right? But the idea would be like this. In Judaism, we know that we have a kind of a 2-week on, 2-week off, I'm not going to get into that now, break, where the husband and wife don't necessarily touch each other for 2 weeks of the month. And that is the Torah's way of sort of bringing in all of the, that kind of spark, that kind of spontaneity. Now I'm going to say the really awkward part, which is, if you're a woman, please not watch this. Men, oftentimes, during the 2 weeks off, sometimes completely detach. Right? Which is the opposite of what you're supposed to do, right? Because you're like, well, when there's that level of intimacy, right? So then I have to be engaged, because any married man knows, like, you can't just show up and be like, ignore your wife. So there's this whole like dance that you have to do in order to keep your wife thinking about you, keep your wife interested. And again, I can do more on that later if that's not what you're doing, and then you don't understand why your wife doesn't want to be around you. But what happens a lot of times is during those 2 weeks, so that's when you're on the phone more often, you're disconnected because you're not thinking. And then, of course, you're surprised when after, it's been 2 weeks, you're like, hey, I'm here. Your wife's like, yeah, no, you're not here because you were never here, and I don't like that. So here's the idea about flirting. Flirting is difficult because it means stepping out of your comfort zone, saying things to your spouse that you're uncomfortable with, that you're vulnerable about. And it's always kind of easier to like rag on her and say stuff here, say that, well, I really don't like when you do X, Y, and Z. That's kind of the opposite. And like, well, I'm being so vulnerable. I'm just being open with myself because, because now I'm going to tell you what I don't like about you. The flip side is, and this is very difficult, and this is a big challenge for men, is to think, I've been married to the same lady for, 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, right? And I actually have to start to think, right? What's gonna put my like actually? Again, this is so. And again, maybe I'm never gonna rant for women, but when men sometimes get turned down a lot in relationships, they have this big scar on them, and so it's kind of hard to go out there and to kind of initiate an interesting conversation with your wife. It's awkward because she's like, I know what you're doing, and they're like, you know what I'm doing. So it requires you to really take the time and to think and to actually get yourself put. And again, how do you know you're doing this? When you feel awkward, kind of like if you were talking to a woman you don't know, right? Because you're trying to push yourself. You're trying to push yourself into an area where it's new territory. So if you're always flirting or you're always commenting on the same things with your wife, she kind of knows. There's like a dance couples do. She knows what you're doing. She knows how you're doing it, right? So you have to sort of work yourself in a different way to say to your wife, you know, how am I going to get you thinking about me? And again, so again, it's a family show. Maybe it's not. Maybe it should be, right? But if you don't text like messages to your wife, right? If you're not doing that, so then starting to text your wife, like sending a romantic text to your wife, if you don't usually do something like that, you're gonna feel super awkward because she's gonna like she don't know what she's gonna say when she gets a text. She's gonna say like, "What are you doing? Right? Why aren't you working? Why are you texting me?" All these kind of things. But that's how you know you feel awkward because you're like you don't know how the response is gonna go back. Just like, for example, not that you do this, but if you go up to a bar and go up in a bar and you'd ask a woman, you know, can I have your phone number? You know what she's gonna say? Yes, no, I have no idea, right? So that sensation of awkward, I don't know what's gonna be next. That's how you know you're flirting, and that's when you get her to kind of come back and to say, wow, you know, like my husband's actually trying to learn this new dance. So I guess the tip for Orthodox married Jewish dudes, right? Again, if you're not keeping these laws where it's 2 on, 2 off, I don't know. I don't know how our marriage would look if we didn't do that, because that naturally kind of brings in this necessity for flirtation and this desire for your spouse, because you literally have to learn how to relate to her when you can't touch her, and you can't talk to her. The other way, excuse me. You can talk to her, but you can't touch her. So it just every time you think you're giving your spouse a hug, and how easy that is to kind of move you to a new level of intimacy, right? You can't do that. So you have to learn how to be intimate without touching her, which is difficult. But the flip side would be for Orthodox married Jewish men for a long period of time, if you're disengaging during those 2 weeks when you can't be around her, or you're disengaging totally, you have to learn how to make yourself awkward again, because that's what's going to actually endear her long term. And that's the idea of how do you bring spice back into spice, interest, you know, fascination. Even though, again, the thing that we crave, the connection, the long-term stability, that's ultimately what kills romance. And so you have to learn how do you bring that romance in to a relationship that is stable. And I think that's putting yourself outside and waiting to see, like, oh my God, how is my spouse going to react? If I do X, you know, is she going to know what I'm doing? And if so, I have to try something different. And again, you're putting yourself out there. So if she says, you know, you're an idiot or don't do that, she wouldn't do that. But, you know, she's like, oh my God, what are you doing? Who would do something like that? And you'd be like, oh, that's awkward. I don't know why I did that, right? But that's the right place to be, because eventually you'll hit that happy medium where you're not uncomfortable taking risks, and your spouse is going to be ever interesting for you. And I told my friend this, like, my buddy, my student, right? I said, like, you're going to be married to a lady, this Jewish lady, and, you know, you're with all these girls beforehand, and unfortunately you don't really hit your stride, I think, in marriage. Again, what do I know, right? But what I'm reading is that you don't really hit that stride until, you know, maybe decades into it. And the beginning part is this whole, like, awkward, like, going through the grind sort of a thing. So that is where we're trying to push ourselves. Great. Peace.